So the title of my paper today, Can They Suffer? Facing Animal Suffering in Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, father of deconstruction, and Primo Levi, the Italian Jewish writer, Auschwitz survivor, implicitly evokes at least two other authors beyond those already explicitly mentioned. The first one is not so obvious when it comes to animals. The term facing is intended to briefly recall here how Emmanuel Levinas, the Lithuanian French Jewish philosopher, theologian, who is responsible for what we call now the ethical turn in philosophy and literary theory, how Emmanuel Levinas put the encounter with the face of the other as the privileged moment of an ethics as first philosophy, as ontology, as we might say. Although Levinas did not recognize animals as having faces, one of the purposes of my paper is to show how rather for both Derrida and Levi, considering pain and suffering as the basic ground of any form of compassion means, firstly, facing quite literally that pain, that suffering, and then responding with a proto-ethics, able to take into account that bare life, that defenseless nudity, if you like, that we, as humans, share with all other creatures. Besides, the fact that Levinas share with our two other authors a common Jewish heritage, and with Levi specifically, the experience of the concentration camp, help us to remember beyond any more or less reasonable comparison that, as Elisabeth de Fontenay wrote in her essay on Plutarch, quote, "It happens that some very great Jewish thinkers of this century have been haunted by the animal question. Victims of historic catastrophes have in fact often seen animals as other victims to a certain extent comparable to themselves and those like them," end quote. The second implicit author is instead quite familiar for whoever works in the field of the so-called animal studies. Jeremy Bentham asks his readers such a question: can they, namely animals, suffer, in a famous footnote of the 17th chapter of the second edition of his Introduction to the Principle of Morals and Legislation, published in 1923. We'll return shortly to him and to his somehow rhetorical question, given that Derrida builds his reflection on what he calls the question of the animal around Bentham's sentence. As we will see, in fact, the stress has not to be posed not simply on the verb to suffer, but on the sentence as a whole. Can they suffer? Because part of the question dwells upon the relationship between what we like to think of as our power over the animals, if not even our biblical dominion over them, and their possibility to respond to such an imposition. It is a relationship in which what is at stake is also a redefinition on the traditional humanistic status of the subject and the humanities as well. Many critics have recognized in Primo Levi a peculiar ethological gaze. His literature, often considered one of the highest examples of humanistic prose, is actually filled with what he liked to call a self-managed zoology. It's not simply the considerable amount of animals that is striking when compared to other writers, but especially the fact that the same human animality, and therefore the divide between humans and animals, is one of the most present topics in his whole oeuvre. Thus, although the text we will discuss in detail is actually an article published in the Italian newspaper La Stampa in 1977, titled Contro il dolore, Against Pain, in order to understand all the nuances of what Levi wrote there, we must at least take a glimpse at the trajectory of his whole literary production on this specific subject. Already in his first book, published in 1947, Se questo è un uomo, If This Is a Man, about his own experience as a Häftling prisoner in Auschwitz, Levi describes the lager as a kind of a scientific experiment, una gigantesca esperienza biologica e sociale, a gigantic biological and social experiment. He writes that it was an experiment that, quote, any experimenter could have set up to establish what is essential and what advantageous to the conduct of the human animal in the struggle for life. But I would like to stress here the fact that in Italian the term is quite different. It's actually animale-uomo. Although the process of dehumanization of the prisoners described by Levi seems to remind us the usual violent rhetoric of animalization, but this time from the perspective of a person who has been looked upon as an animal, nevertheless, the peculiar hyphenated expression utilized by Levi, animale-uomo, as I said, becomes for him almost paradigmatic of the human condition as a whole, when it comes to a state of suffering. This testifies exemplarily, but at least to clear occurrences, belonging both to moments marked by a deep reflection about his own experience as both a writer, but he was also a professional chemist, an Italian, but also a Jew, and, why not, a human, but also an animal. In other words, a centaur, as he was accustomed to describe himself. The first occurrence is in impersonal anthology titled Search for Roots, published in Italy in 1981. The biblical figure of Job opens the volume. Before the cruel bet between God and Satan, Job, the just, Levi writes, quote, degraded to an animal for an experiment, comports himself as any of us would, end quote. Here the paradigmatic and somehow primitively ethical condition of Job, according to Levi, lies in this double nature. His suffering is precisely human, although, but I would rather say because, he has been degraded to the condition of an animal in an experiment. The second one is in last volume, in which he returns specifically to interrogate his experience in Auschwitz, The Drowned and the Saved, published in Italy in 1986. In several passages, Levi has described the condition of women in the lager as equivalent to defenseless animals. This comparison becomes clear in this last volume, in the chapter titled Violenza inutile, useless violence. Here Levi maintains that a peculiar feature of Nazism was precisely a diffuse, useless violence, directed exclusively to create a redundant, out-of-proportion pain. Explaining this statement, he adds that this pain concerned the same offensive and deliberate process of animalization we have already mentioned. However, the extreme example of such a violence regarded the destiny of those, as Levi writes again, who were completely defenseless, and it was what he describes as the pitiless utilization of the body of the prisoners as an object, as, quote, an anonymous thing which one could dispose of in an arbitrary manner. It seems significant to me, Levi concludes, to recall this abomination at a time when, for good reasons, there are discussions as to within what limits it is permissible to perform painful experiments on laboratory animals, end quote. The limit of our behavior toward others are indeed the very topic of Contro il Dolore. As I said, this article was published for the first time on La Stampa in August 1977, and it is the epiphenomenon of a controversy begun almost 2 years earlier when the Swiss racing driver, novelist, and international prominent activist against animal experiments and vivisection, Hans Ruesch, began his battle publishing in Italian the book entitled L'Imperatrice Nuda, translated afterwards in English first as The Slaughter of the Innocents in 1978, and eventually as The Naked Empress or The Great Medical Fraud in 1982. I have no time here to deal in details with all the arguments against vivisection brought up by Ruesch, but it is important to keep in mind that not simply La Stampa had given special attention to this topic, but also there was already an ongoing discussion when Levi decided to write his article. Levi does not then respond directly to Ruesch's arguments, but rather to a letter sent to the newspaper and published on July 26, 1977, a letter by the moral theologian Enrico Chiavacci that was published under the title Il Cristianesimo e gli Animali, Christianity and the Animals, as a general perspective on the ways Christianity should deal with the issue of vivisection and animal suffering. Levi begins his response with a strong rejection of any solipsism, especially for its inability to take into account any form of otherness. This kind of blindness toward the other is also what he sees in Chiavacci's arguments, and what leads him to reject also the theory maintained by the theologian that, quote, a certain measure of suffering inflicted on animals supposedly is acceptable only because every animal is at the service of man, end quote. Levi, in fact, refuses both the idea that this world is a gift given by God specifically to humans and the paradigm of the goodness of all animals, maintaining instead that our moral categories do not suit animals, because the struggle for life, he says, is either below or above human criteria. Nevertheless, this does not lead him to a complete dismissal of any form of proto-ethical consideration toward the animals. Rather, Levi writes, and this is his main argument, quote, animals must indeed be respected, but for different reasons. Not because they are good or useful, not all of them are, but because a rule written in us and recognized by all religions and all legislations command us not to create pain, neither in ourselves nor in any creature capable of perceiving. End quote. Pain, suffering, and the real ethical discriminating factors. A pain and a suffering that arguably have to be recognized, but there are definitely that undeniable pollution, Levy's words, that seem to put all the animals, human or not, on the same ground. Pain has indeed such a powerful strength that is even able to replace one of the most resistant paradigms of Western philosophy, one of those the same Levy was haunted by before Auschwitz. As he writes in a short story entitled Un Testamento, never translated into English, pain is actually even stronger than Cartesian cogito, if we consider that, quote, often who thinks is not so sure is thinking. Instead, who suffers, yes, who suffers has no doubts, ever. Who suffers, alas, is always sure that he suffers and therefore he exists. Patior ergo sum, I suffer, therefore I am, Levy seems to claim. In his view, the undeniable and somehow passive suffering of every defenseless creature reveals that at the bottom of every form of compassion, what the Nazis, he says, did not experience, there is the finitude of a naked body able to call us into a necessary response. It is here, at this point, that Levy meets Derrida's reflection on the human-animal divide and specifically on Bentham's question. Although, as Derrida himself stated in more than one occasion, the question of the animal is present from the very beginning in his reflection upon the whole canon of Western philosophy, it is only what he has been published under the ironical pseudo-Cartesian title The Animal, Therefore I Am in 2006 that he takes, at least, a philosophically precise position toward how we as humans treat animals. Taking into account again that Derrida came from a Jewish family, it's important to ponder carefully the weight of what he is saying when he maintains that what he calls the unprecedented proportion of the subjection of the animal has taken the dimension, quote, of the worst cases of genocide. Derrida continues, quote, everybody knows what a terrifying and intolerable picture a realist painting could give to the industrial, mechanical, chemical, hormonal, and genetic violence to which man has been submitting animal life for the past 2 centuries, end quote. The only response to such an event, according to him, is a new practice of fundamental compassion that would have to change, quote, even the very cornerstone of the philosophical problematic of the animal, end quote. The question, though, might be about of what kind of ground such a compassion has to be built. Is the idea of applying human rights as they are to animals a solid enough ground? Or, in other words, how can we rethink the human-animal divide in order to find a common ground that is not simply the imposition of our subjective categories over the other animals? In order to try to find an answer, Derrida turns to Bentham. It is time, almost at the end of my presentation today, to quote the original sentence in its entirety. In 1823, the same man responsible for that panopticon made so famous by Foucault's biopolitical theory, wrote that for him, when it comes to our compassion toward other creatures, quote, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? End quote. It is well known what another utilitarian philosopher as Peter Singer made out of this thought. As Matthew Calarco in his fascinating volume entitled Zoographies has already pointed out, Derrida takes a completely different path. Sharing somehow the same fundamental shift of attention from thinking, speaking towards suffering, Derrida nevertheless does not focus his attention on the animal's capacity to feel pleasure or, as in this case, pain. He rather uses Bentham's question to broach the issue of the embodied exposures of animals, their finitude and vulnerability. To quote the already mentioned Calarco here, while the surface level of Bentham's discourse speaks in terms of capacities and faculties, can they suffer? Derrida wants to suggest that capacities are not the final foundation of animal ethics. Indeed, what the French philosopher stresses is that Bentham's rhetorical question is disturbed by what he calls a certain passivity. Rather than being about a capacity, he continues, it, quote, testifies to a sufferance, a passion and not being able. The real question then switches from can they suffer to can they not be able, Or in other words, from a capacity to an inability, because Derrida adds, quote, being able to suffer is no longer a power. It is a possibility without power, a possibility of the impossible, end quote. Leaving aside Derrida's jargon here, the meaning of what he is saying is quite clear. As he explains immediately afterwards, in fact, mortality resides there as the most radical means of thinking the finitude that we share with animals, the mortality that belongs to the very finitude of life, to the experience of compassion, to the possibility of sharing, the possibility of this non-power. The foundation of his proto-ethics, then, is no longer a theory of agency, a capacity to behave or act or perform in a certain way. Rather, what is at stake is a certain zero degree of what has been called the human subject, once reduced to his bare life, to his bodily vulnerability. I conclude. What the hyperhuman testimony of Primo Levi and the post-humanistic philosophy of Jacques Derrida seems to have in common is a particular switch from an ethics based on a former capacity of agency toward a proto-ethics that is instead deeply grounded upon the finitude of the vulnerable body that belongs to any creatures. Only thinking about our own impossibility to avoid pain and suffering, pondering upon that bare life that is also our own fundamental fragility, we as humans might claim that limitrophy with other creatures, able to open the space of a real compati, literally to suffer with the other, compassion. Thank you.